Welcome back to our channel. She was imprisoned by the Vatican, her hands sealed in iron gloves, and branded a witch because of mysterious wounds on her body. But the horrifying truth was only revealed after her death. When surgeons opened St. Veronica Giuliani's chest, they stood speechless in astonishment. Inside her heart, they found the physical calcified shape of a cross and a crown of thorns, clearly etched into the heart muscle. She was not insane. She carried the pain of Christ in every heartbeat, literally. Veronica Giuliani was not a raving peasant girl found wandering the Umbrian hills. She was a disciplined Capuchin nun, a woman of iron will rising within the strict hierarchy of the church. Born Ursula Giuliani on December 27, 1660 in Italy, she was a spiritual prodigy. From the tender age of 3, she displayed a profound sensitivity, meditating on the Passion of Christ, and by 7 she yearned to dedicate her life to God. Despite initial opposition from her father, in 1677, at the age of 17, she entered the Capuchin convent in Città di Castello. She took the religious name Veronica, honoring the woman who wiped the face of Jesus, symbolizing her life's mission to comfort him and offer reparation for the sins of the world. Her monastic life was defined by intense supernatural phenomena and a consuming desire to share in Christ's suffering. She frequently fell into ecstatic trances, reporting vivid visions of heaven and hell and engaging in direct dialogues with Christ. Yet secretly she harbored a claim so radical it bordered on blasphemy. She insisted that the physical instruments of Christ's passion, the cross, the crown, the nails, were not merely spiritual symbols, but solid objects growing inside her living heart. To the medical men of the 18th century, this was biological madness. To the Vatican, it was a political minefield. The Counter-Reformation Church was tired of false mystics and operated on a ruthless principle, guilty until proven saintly. Bishop Eustachi needed absolute proof, not faith. Relying on cold anatomy, he ordered a dissection the moment she died, intending to expose a delusional fraud. Instead, what was meant to be a simple surgical procedure became one of the most baffling autopsies in the history of medicine. At the age of 37, Veronica began to display the stigmata, the wounds of Christ appearing on her hands, feet, and side. The reaction from the hierarchy was immediate and hostile. Bishop Antonio Eustachi didn't see a miracle. He saw a hysteria case that threatened to embarrass his diocese. Being a pragmatist who understood the politics of Rome, he viewed Veronica not as a saint to be venerated, but as a problem to be solved. His approach was clinical and skeptical. He assumed she was lying. The investigation was established with a presumption of guilt. If a woman bleeds from her hands without a medical cause, the most logical explanation is that she is inflicting the injuries herself using hidden tools. The burden of proof was entirely on her, and the bishop intended to make that proof impossible to fake. He ordered a strict medical investigation that bordered on torture. The goal was to prove that these wounds were self-inflicted. The method they chose was brutal in its simplicity, the glove test. The medical team devised a containment protocol designed to eliminate human agency. They focused on the hands because the hands were the primary tools for any potential deception. If she was using a knife, a needle, or a caustic acid to create the wounds, mechanically disabling her hands would stop the phenomenon. They bandaged her hands and placed them inside stiff leather gloves. These weren't ordinary gloves. They were sealed at the wrists with lead seals, stamped with the bishop's signet. The application of the lead seals turned her own body into a secured evidence locker. The seals meant that the gloves could not be removed without breaking the wax or lead, which would immediately reveal tampering. The keys were taken away. This was total incapacitation. A human being relies on their hands for every basic function of survival, from feeding to hygiene. Veronica was rendered helpless. She had to be fed by others like an infant. She could not wash herself or adjust her clothing. She was forced to rely on the very nuns who were instructed to doubt her. For weeks, Veronica lived in these restraints. She could not use her hands to eat, to wash, or to tend to her own needs. More importantly, she physically could not scratch or cut herself. The medical logic was sound. Cut off the cause and you observe the effect. Without access to the skin, the wound should have followed the natural laws of physiology. Biology is predictable. When tissue is damaged, platelets clot the blood, scabs form, and the skin regenerates. The doctors waited. They monitored the gloves for signs of external damage. They checked the seals daily. They expected the wounds to heal, as any natural scratch would, when protected from interference. But biology failed to cooperate. When the seals were broken for weekly inspection, the bandages were not dry. They were soaked in fresh arterial blood. There was no infection, no pus, and no sign of healing. Instead, the wound stayed fresh. The persistence of the wounds frustrated the examiners. It suggested that the source was internal, not external, but they were not ready to admit a miracle. They shifted their hypothesis from mechanical fraud to psychological delusion or nerve manipulation. They needed to test the physical sensitivity of the lesions. The doctors escalated their testing. They needed to gauge the depth of the wounds and the reality of her pain. This phase was indistinguishable from torture, legitimized by a medical degree. They treated her hands as biological specimens rather than parts of a human being. In a gruesome examination, they took metal needles and drove them deep into the center of the stigma, scraping against the underlying tissue to determine if the wound penetrated the muscle. When that failed to break her composure, they escalated further, applying scalding liquids and harsh spirits directly onto the raw, open nerves. They watched her eyes, they watched her breathing. A normal nervous system reacts to invasive pain with a withdrawal reflex, an involuntary flinch. They were waiting for that flinch. The medical team was waiting for a scream, a flinch, or the involuntary recoil that biology demands of the human body. Yet throughout this clinical abuse, Veronica remained terrifyingly still. She did not beg them to stop. She simply observed the procedure as if it were happening to someone else. This silence unnerved the examiners more than the wounds themselves. They were no longer dealing with a fraud, but with a physiological anomaly they could not explain. The skepticism of the doctors was further challenged by the biological clock of her wounds. For years, witnesses documented a cycle that no self-harming individual could sustain. Her stigmata followed a strict timetable. The wounds would begin to open and weep blood at noon on Friday. The bleeding and pain would peak at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the biblical hour of Christ's death. Then they would stop. By Saturday morning, the wounds would be closed, covered by a thin layer of new skin. Biologically, this is absurd. Wound healing is a complex process of clotting, inflammation, and tissue regeneration that takes days or weeks. To go from an open bleeding lesion to closed skin in 12 hours, and to repeat this trauma every 7 days for decades without developing sepsis or gangrene, is medically inexplicable. Furthermore, there was the scent paradox. In the 17th century, infection was a death sentence. An open wound in a humid Italian summer smells of necrosis, rotting meat. Yet the doctors and nuns who handled the blood-soaked bandages of Veronica Giuliani reported no smell of iron or decay. Instead, they consistently reported a floral scent, described as jasmine or lilies. This phenomenon, known as the odor of sanctity, appears in many hagiographies, but here it appears in the sworn testimony of skeptics who were actively looking for signs of fraud. Faced with biology that refused to fail, the bishop realized that physical pain and observation were ineffective. He changed tactics. If the body is iron, attack the mind. The church moved to psychological warfare. The logic was ruthless. Fake mystics are driven by pride. They want attention, followers, and special treatment. If you strip away the audience and the status, the performance usually stops. If they couldn't prove she was faking the wounds, they would prove she was insane or possessed. The order was given to isolate her completely. The bishop ordered her into strict solitary confinement within her own convent. For 50 days she was locked in a dark cell. The cell was likely an infirmary room or a storage closet, stripped of comfort and light. She was cut off from the rhythms of the convent life that defined her existence. She was stripped of her role as novice mistress, a position of authority and respect she had earned over years of service. Suddenly, she was nobody. She was forbidden from speaking to the other sisters. The silence was enforced by strict obedience. Even worse for a nun, she was barred from attending Mass. This was a spiritual starvation tactic. To deny a Catholic nun the Eucharist is to cut off her lifeline. It implies she is unworthy, unclean, perhaps even demonic. The isolation was coupled with active degradation designed to shatter her ego. The bishop weaponized the convent against her, ordering the other sisters to treat their former leader with contempt. The ultimate test of her humility played out in the refectory. Veronica was stripped of her seat at the table and forced to eat her meals on the floor, sharing the stone tiles with the convent cats. The inquisitors were baiting her. They believed that a fraudster driven by narcissism would eventually crack under such ridicule and demand respect. They waited for an outburst of pride that would expose her piety as a mask. Yet, Veronica complied with every order. She ate among the animals, accepted the insults, and remained in the dark, offering them nothing but total obedience. During this confinement, her confessor commanded her to write. He ordered her to document every thought, every vision, and every pain. He likely expected the ramblings of a broken mind. What he got was a library. Over the rest of her life, Veronica produced 22,000 handwritten pages. This output was not merely a spiritual exercise, it was a physical feat of endurance. To produce that volume of text by candlelight, using a quill and ink, required a discipline that bordered on obsession. The sheer logistics of such an undertaking within the walls of an 18th century convent were staggering. This was not the leisurely journaling of a scholar. It was the frantic industrial output of a woman possessed by the need to record. For 34 years, Veronica Giuliani acted as a stenographer to the supernatural. The physical act of writing in the 1700s was a laborious task, requiring the constant sharpening of quills, the mixing of ink, and the preservation of scarce paper. To fill 10 massive volumes, which would later be transcribed into 44 printed tomes, she had to steal hours from sleep, writing in the dead of night while her sisters rested. Her hands, often swollen and bleeding from the very stigmata she was describing, would cramp around the pen, yet the handwriting remained terrifyingly steady. It did not devolve into the frantic scrawl of a madwoman. It retained the precise looped clarity of a legal clerk. The confessor had asked for a logbook of her mental state, perhaps hoping to find evidence of heresy or incoherence that could justify her expulsion. Instead, he received a comprehensive encyclopedia of her internal world. The sheer weight of the paper became a physical presence in the monastery, a growing monument to her endurance that the priests could not ignore. They were looking for a confession of fraud. What they received was a data set. She chronicled her experiences not with the vagueness of a dream, but with the specific time-stamping of a laboratory report. She recorded the duration of her trances, the exact words spoken by divine figures, and the physical after-effects on her body. It was a relentless audit of the soul. The writing style was not the ecstatic poetry common to mystics of the era. It was dry, observational, and reporterly. She treated her visions as objective events that needed to be recorded for the record. Among them were descriptions of hell that were not vague metaphors, but cartographic nightmares. She described the smell of sulfur, the specific acoustics of the screams, and the hierarchy of punishments with the precision of a geographer mapping a new continent. Where Dante Alighieri wrote in poetic stanzas, Veronica Giuliani wrote in schematics. She did not simply describe the terror of the inferno, she analyzed its infrastructure. Her diaries contain detailed observations on the zoning of hell, breaking down the abyss into distinct sectors reserved for specific transgressions. She described the walls of the pit not as abstract shadows, but as physical barriers constructed to maximize claustrophobia. She noted the texture of the stone, the viscosity of the mud, and the temperature gradients between the different levels of the damned. She approached the supernatural with the eye of an architect. She detailed the dimensions of the torture chambers, the placement of the fires, and the specific auditory frequencies of the damned. In one particularly chilling entry, she analyzed the soundscape of the underworld. She did not just report screaming, she categorized the cries. She noted that the screams in the lower circles had a different pitch, a frequency of absolute despair, compared to the angry shouts of the upper levels. She described a cacophony that was not random, but engineered to assault the senses of the soul, a distinct acoustic of pain that she claimed to hear with the clarity of a bell. She described the 7 swords of suffering with the detachment of a surgeon listing instruments, explaining how each specific torment was calibrated to the sin it punished. It was data. She did not write to evoke fear, she wrote to document coordinates. This was the most unnerving aspect for the church authorities who reviewed her work. A fraudster trying to scare a congregation uses adjectives. Veronica used nouns and measurements. She described the hierarchy of demons with the familiarity of someone describing a royal court or a military chain of command. She named them, described their ranks, and detailed their specific jurisdictions over human vices. It was a bureaucratic breakdown of evil. Her tone suggested that hell was not a place of chaotic riot, but a place of terrifying order, a prison system run with absolute, cruel efficiency. This analytical detachment made the text more terrifying than any emotional outburst could have been. It suggested that she was not imagining these places, but visiting them and taking notes. The psychological implication was that she was a traveler returning from a foreign land with a survey map. She wrote as if she had walked the perimeter of the lake of fire and measured its depth. It carries the cold impression of a witness who has become desensitized to the horror through constant exposure. A woman who could look at eternal damnation and think about the floor plan. She categorized the levels of suffering with a bureaucratic efficiency that unnerved the priests who read them. She called herself the mapper of pain. But the most disturbing claim came later in her life, a claim that would eventually lead to the autopsy table. Veronica told her confessor that the stigmata on her hands were just the surface. She claimed that the true passion was happening inside her chest. She insisted that God had physically placed the instruments of the crucifixion inside her heart. This was a radical escalation of her case. Stigmata on the skin could be faked with acid or needles. Internal stigmata could not be forged without killing the host. She was describing a physical invasion of a vital organ. She spoke of the sensation of a hard object expanding within the ventricle, of the sharp pain of a lance tip resting against the valve. She did not describe these as spiritual weights. She described them as foreign bodies. She even drew a diagram in her diary. She sketched the ventricles and marked the exact positions. Here lay the cross, there lay the 3 nails, here was the lance, and there was the crown of thorns. The drawing was specific. It was a schematic. She placed the cross in the right ventricle, standing vertically. She marked the curvature of the crown of thorns, wrapping around the upper vessels. She acted as her own radiologist, identifying structures inside her own body that she could not possibly see. To the medical men who reviewed her claims, this was the raving of a patient who had lost touch with biological reality. The heart is a pump. It relies on the smooth contraction of muscle and the unobstructed flow of blood. Introducing solid, irregular objects into the chambers would cause immediate catastrophic failure. It would trigger clots, embolisms, or cardiac arrest. To the doctors of the 18th century, this was biologically impossible. A foreign object in the heart means death. You do not live with a spear tip in your ventricle. They dismissed it as the ultimate delusion of an aging nun. The end finally came in the summer of 1727. After a lifetime of suffering, Veronica succumbed to a stroke at the age of 67. The bishop, remembering her wild claims about her heart, saw an opportunity to close the book on the Veronica Giuliani case once and for all. He ordered a post-mortem examination. This was to be a public event attended by the governor, the medical establishment, and senior clergy. The atmosphere was not one of reverence. It was an inquest. The bishop wanted a final answer. If the heart was normal, the church could label her a hysteric and move on. If the heart was abnormal, they needed to control the narrative immediately. The presence of the governor and the secular doctors turned the convent room into a courtroom. The body was laid out not for worship, but for dissection. This was a tribunal of fact, and the primary witness was the cadaver itself. They wanted to see the heart that supposedly held a cross. Dr. Bordiga made the incision. The room was tense. The heat of the Italian summer likely made the air stifling, adding to the pressure of the moment. Bordiga was a man of science, there to perform a technical task. He sawed through the sternum and exposed the thoracic cavity. The sound of the saw cutting through the breastbone was the only noise in the room. He retracted the ribs to reveal the organs. He removed the heart. The first step was a visual inspection of the exterior. He looked for scars, sutures, or any sign that the chest had been opened during her life. Fraud required access. If she had inserted objects into her heart, she would have had to cut herself open to do it. The skin was unbroken. The chest wall was intact. The pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, was untouched. Externally, it appeared relatively normal, though there was no scarring on the chest wall to suggest anyone had ever surgically opened her up before. The claim of internal objects had to be false. There was no way to get them in there. Then, Dr. Bordiga sliced into the right ventricle. The blade moved through the muscle tissue, expecting the resistance of soft flesh. Instead, it hit a barrier. The tactile feedback was wrong. It was like cutting into fruit and hitting a stone. The room went quiet. Embedded in the cardiac muscle were not blood clots and not soft polyps. Blood clots are common in autopsies. They are soft, jelly-like, and easily crushed. Polyps are fleshy tumors. What Bordiga encountered was neither. There were hard, distinct formations. He had to use instruments to separate the tissue from the objects. These were not loose items floating in the blood. They were integrated into the heart wall, grown out of the muscle itself. Bordiga reached in with his forceps. He didn't pull out loose objects. He found that the heart muscle itself had calcified and reshaped itself. He extracted the first structure. It was a piece of hard, bone-like tissue. It was not a vague lump that required imagination to interpret. It had a vertical shaft and a horizontal bar. It was shaped perfectly like a tiny cross. The texture was fibrous and dense, similar to cartilage that had hardened over decades. It held its shape when placed on the dissection tray. The surgeon then extracted a second formation. It was a curved piece of callous tissue, forming a C, which the faithful interpreted as caritas, or charity. Others identified it as the crown of thorns. The precision was unnerving. Biology does not typically produce geometric shapes. Calcifications are usually irregular, jagged deposits. These were architectural. He found tiny nail-like spurs. These were sharp, distinct points of hardened tissue located exactly where Veronica's diagram had placed the nails of the Passion. The autopsy report, which still exists in the Vatican archives, is clinical and dry, which makes it all the more terrifying. Dr. Bordiga wrote, "These things I have seen with my own eyes and touched with my own hands." He was careful to note that these were not foreign objects introduced from the outside. They were somatic mutations. The heart had reorganized its own cellular structure to build these symbols. The report detailed the hardness of the objects, noting that they resisted the pressure of the scalpel. The crown of thorns was not a wire, but a series of small, hard nodules circling the aorta, constricting it, yet somehow never blocking the blood flow enough to kill her during her life. This constriction presented a hemodynamic puzzle. The aorta is the main pipeline of the body. To have it encircled by a ring of hard nodules should have caused high blood pressure, turbulent flow, or a rupture. Yet she had lived until 67 with a heart that was mechanically compromised. The doctors then looked at the left ventricle. They found a tear. This was perhaps the most medically baffling finding of the entire procedure. It was a physical rupture in the heart wall, consistent with what mystics call the transverberation, the wound of the lance. The tear was clean and distinct, passing through the ventricular muscle. In medical terms, a ruptured ventricle causes cardiac tamponade. The pericardium fills with blood, the heart is strangled, and death follows in minutes. The heart pumps under immense pressure. If the wall is breached, the blood jets out into the sac surrounding the heart. The sac fills, exerting inward pressure, preventing the heart from refilling with blood. Circulation stops. It is a mechanic failure that is universally fatal without immediate surgical repair. Yet the scar tissue suggested Veronica had lived with this hole in her heart for years. The edges of the wound were not fresh. They showed signs of chronic existence. The tissue around the tear was not necrotic or dead. It was viable. The heart had continued to pump, maintaining blood pressure, despite a breach that should have killed her instantly. The physiology of her heart ignored the laws of hydrodynamics. The blood stayed in the chamber despite the exit path. The wound was in a state of suspended animation, neither fully healed nor fully open. It was a permanent trauma that refused to resolve, a biological impossibility documented by a surgeon who was looking for a natural cause of death. Having cataloged the anomalies of the soft tissue, the doctors stripped the body further to examine the skeletal structure. The investigation moved from the soft tissue to the frame of the body itself. They noticed something wrong with her right shoulder. The anatomy of the scapula was distorted. The bone was depressed, bent inwards as if it had been under colossal crushing weight for decades. Bone is a living material. It adheres to Wolff's law, which states that bone density and shape adapt to the mechanical loads placed upon it. If you lift heavy weights, your bones thicken. If you carry a heavy load on one shoulder for 30 years, the bone will curve and depress to support that specific stress point. This is a deformity often found in porters or laborers who carry heavy timber or stone all their lives. Forensic anthropologists use these markers to identify the professions of ancient skeletons. A bricklayer has a specific skeletal signature, a scribe has another. But Veronica was a cloistered nun. She carried nothing heavier than a prayer book. She lived a sedentary life of prayer and needlework. There was no physical source for the load. She did not haul stone for the convent walls. She did not carry timber for the fires. Yet her right shoulder blade was warped as if she had been a beast of burden. The depression in the bone was deep and structural. It was not a surface bruise. It was a remodeling of the skeletal matrix. The deformity perfectly matched her diary entries, where she claimed to carry the physical weight of Christ's cross on her shoulder every single day. She had written about the phantom weight, the grinding pressure of the wood against her shoulder, the exhaustion of the burden. Her nervous system had communicated this weight to her body with such fidelity that her bones accepted it as gravity. Her belief was so strong, or the burden so real, that her own skeleton had warped to accommodate an invisible beam of wood. The investigation into Veronica Giuliani was designed to destroy a fake. Instead, it produced the most rigorously documented case of mystical pathology in history. The church, which had locked her up and treated her as a mental patient, had to reverse its verdict. It took over a century, but in 1839 she was canonized. Modern pathology offers a different verdict: psychosomatic manifestation. The theory suggests that a brain focused entirely on the passion can force the body to conform to a belief. It is a medical fact that stress can cause ulcers or hair loss. Could a mind focused entirely on the passion of Christ force the capillaries in the hands to burst on a Friday? Could intense visualization calcify heart tissue into the shape of a cross? If so, that ability is a miracle in itself, a testament to the terrifying power of the human mind. Veronica Giuliani remains a disturbing figure. She is not the gentle saint of picture books. She is the saint of the autopsy table. Her legacy is not just in her prayers, but in the medical report signed by Doctor Bordiga. Her heart, now shriveled and dry, is still kept in a reliquary in Città di Castello. The tiny cross and the crown of thorns are still visible within the tissue. They remain a silent challenge to our understanding of reality, proof that for one woman the boundary between the spirit and the flesh had not just been crossed, it had been surgically removed. Veronica Giuliani's autopsy challenges the boundary between faith and biology, leaving us with more questions than answers, but history is full of such anomalies waiting to be re-examined. Is there another historical figure, a mystic, a royal, or a misunderstood outcast, whose life you want us to investigate with this level of detail? Perhaps someone else buried in the Vatican archives, or a medical mystery that science still cannot explain. Please let us know in the comments below. And if you value this kind of in-depth historical research, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It supports our work and allows us to dig deeper into the archives to bring these forgotten stories back to light. Thank you for watching.